The fierce prairie wind howled like a living beast across the Kansas grassland, threatening to tear everything apart. Elias Big Eli Thornton stood atop the half-finished roof beams of his new home, his massive 6 feet 7 inches frame braced against the storm. Rain lashed his face as he gripped a heavy oak beam that most men could barely lift. One wrong move and the timber would crash down, possibly crushing him beneath its weight. His powerful hands, scarred from years of roping wild cattle on the long drives from Texas, strained against the wood. Lightning cracked across the darkening sky, illuminating the endless sea of grass bending low in submission. At 32, Big Eli had faced down stampedes and outlaws, but this moment felt different. This was not just building a shelter, it was building a future. His muscles burned as he fought the wind, teeth clenched, refusing to let the storm claim what he had worked so hard to create. With a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself, he heaved the final beam into place and lashed it down. The house would stand. It had to. As the storm began to ease into a steady autumn drizzle, Eli climbed down from the roof, his soaked shirt clinging to his enormous shoulders. He wiped the rain from his eyes and looked at what he had built on his 320 acres of homestead land. 4 solid rooms, a proper stone fireplace with a wide hearth, and 2 south-facing windows designed to catch every precious bit of winter sunlight. But the most important part wasn't the walls or the roof. It was the long front porch and the 2 sturdy rocking chairs that sat upon it. He had built those chairs first weeks before the roof was even started, carving them from the strongest oak he could find. They were heavy, well-balanced pieces meant to last a lifetime. Now they stood side by side on the unfinished porch, looking out over the vast Kansas prairie where the golden grass stretched until it melted into the sky. 2 chairs, one for him, one waiting for her, whoever she might be. Ezra Briggs, his nearest neighbor and an old cowboy himself, rode up the next morning just as the sun broke through the clouds. The wireman dismounted and stared at the scene before him, shaking his head in disbelief. "Big Eli, you crazy son of a gun!" Ezra called out, tying his horse to a post. "You got a roof half done and 2 fine chairs sitting out here like you're expecting company for tea. You don't even have a wife yet." Eli straightened up from where he was fitting a porch rail, his towering presence casting a long shadow even in the morning light. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that carried weight without needing to shout. "Not yet," Ezra laughed, but there was concern in his eyes. "You're pretty sure about this, ain't you?" "I'm sure about the chairs," Eli replied simply. He ran a massive hand over the smooth wood of the second chair. "The rest will follow." This was the kind of man Elias Thornton was. Practical to his core, yet possessed of a deep forward-thinking certainty that others often found strange. He had filed on this land under the Homestead Act 2 years earlier, with a clear vision he would raise wheat, especially the hardy turkey red variety some Mennonite families had brought from Russia, run some cattle and build something lasting. But he would not do it alone. He had seen what loneliness did to men on the frontier. His own father had pioneered into Missouri in the 1840s, built a respectable farm and spent 20 years filling it with crops and livestock, but almost nothing else. The old man had died in an empty house, the silence his only companion. Eli had stood at that graveside and made a quiet vow he would not repeat that lonely legacy. As the days passed, Eli worked with quiet determination. His giant frame allowed him to do the work of 3 men. He split logs for the fireplace, hauled stones for the foundation, and carefully fitted every joint. Neighbors occasionally stopped by, drawn by stories of the giant cowboy who had left the cattle trails to settle down. They marveled at the house rising steadily from the prairie and whispered about those 2 chairs waiting patiently on the porch. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the grass in shades of amber and gold, Eli sat in the first chair. The wood creaked softly beneath his weight. Orion, his loyal cattle dog with sharp, intelligent eyes, trotted over and leaned against his leg. Eli rested a heavy hand on the dog's head. The prairie stretched before him, vast and indifferent, yet full of promise. The wind whispered through the grass like a secret. For the first time in years, Eli allowed himself to feel the weight of his solitude, not as a burden, but as a problem that could be solved. He rose, went inside, and sat at the rough table he had built. By the light of a lantern, he took out a sheet of paper and began drafting his matrimonial advertisement for the Kansas City Journal. He wrote honestly about his land, his health, his habits. He mentioned his years driving cattle across dangerous trails and his desire to build something more permanent. Then, in a moment that felt both practical and deeply vulnerable, he added the line that would change everything. The house has a porch with 2 chairs and a view of the grass that goes on until it meets the sky. And I would very much like someone to sit in the second chair. Eli read the words over once, then twice. He folded the paper carefully. Tomorrow he would send it. As night fell over the Kansas prairie, the 2 chairs remained on the porch, empty but full of quiet expectation. Somewhere far to the east in the crowded streets of Philadelphia, a woman who had not yet heard his name was living a life that felt increasingly too small. Big Eli Thornton did not know her name, but as he lay down that night in his half-finished house, listening to the wind move across the endless grass, he felt for the first time in a long while that the second chair would not stay empty forever. The advertisement appeared in the Kansas City Journal on a crisp November morning in 1879. Elias Big Eli Thornton had ridden into town himself to deliver it his massive frame drawing stairs as he handed the carefully written notice to the editor. He paid the fee without hesitation, then returned to his prairie homestead under a wide, pale sky. For the next several days, he threw himself into finishing the roof and stocking the root cellar, but his mind kept returning to those printed words now traveling across the state. He wondered if anyone would truly understand what he meant by that final sentence about the 2 chairs. 43 letters eventually arrived at the small post office in the nearest settlement. Eli collected them in a worn leather pouch, bringing them home to read by the light of his lantern. Most were polite but distant, some were overly sentimental, a few were clearly desperate. He set them aside one by one with quiet patience, his large hands handling the thin paper with surprising gentleness. None of them felt right. Not yet. Hundreds of miles east in the bustling streets of Philadelphia, Clara Whitaker worked late into the evening at her father's printing shop. The air was thick with the sharp scent of ink and metal type. At 27, she moved with practiced efficiency between the cases of letters, her fingers nimble from years of setting type since she was barely 12. It was unusual work for a woman, but Clara had never cared much for what was usual. She wore a simple, dark dress stained with ink at the cuffs, her dark hair pinned back neatly, and her sharp hazel eyes missed nothing. Her father, Mr. Whitaker, had built a respectable business printing newspapers, pamphlets, and books for the city's growing middle class. But lately the weight of it all pressed heavily on Clara. The endless expectations of Philadelphia society, proper marriages, quiet domestic lives, women who smiled sweetly and spoke softly, felt like a cage closing around her. She had watched friends marry men they barely respected, settling into lives of polite discontent. Clara wanted more. She wanted honesty. She wanted room to breathe and think and be exactly who she was. For months now, during quiet moments between jobs, she had been reading the matrimonial advertisements from Western papers that occasionally crossed her desk. She approached them with the same critical eye she used for spotting errors in type. Most were flowery lies or desperate pleas. She marked them coldly, noting inconsistencies the way she corrected a sloppy compositor's work. That evening, after her father had gone home complaining of a headache, Clara lingered at the shop. The big press stood silent. She wiped her hands on a rag and picked up the latest bundle of Western papers. Her eyes scanned the columns until they landed on the advertisement from Kansas. Homestead owner, 32 years of age, 320 acres under the Homestead Act, healthy, temperate, and of steady character, seeks a honest woman for marriage and partnership on the prairie. The house has a porch with 2 chairs and a view of the grass that goes on until it meets the sky. And I would very much like someone to sit in the second chair. Clara read the words once, then again, and then a third time slower. Something about that simple, unadorned sentence pierced through her usual detachment. It was not poetic in the usual way. It was practical, almost humble, yet it carried a depth of longing that felt startlingly real. She imagined the vast open land, the endless sky, and 2 chairs waiting on a porch. No pretense, no games, just a man who had built something and wanted someone to share it with. She sat down in her usual chair at the typesetting table, the smell of ink strong around her. For a long time she stared at the paper. Other ads spoke of beauty, of cooking skills, of obedience. This one spoke of a chair, of companionship, of seeing the same view together. Clara thought about her own life, the late nights reading by candlelight, her frustration with the city's rigid rules, her secret yearning for a place where a woman who worked with her hands and her mind might not be considered strange. She had no illusions about the hardships of the West, but she also knew she could not stay here slowly fading into a life that had already been decided for her. With careful movements, she took out a fresh sheet of paper. Her pen moved steadily as she composed the most honest letter she had ever written. She told this unknown man about her work as a compositor, how she had grown up surrounded by words and ink. She admitted she had few traditional domestic skills beyond keeping things orderly. She described her habit of reading deep into the night and her belief that the frontier might allow a person to live truthfully without the city's constant judgment. She did not try to sound charming or delicate. She wrote as she was direct, thoughtful, unafraid. And though she did not mention the chairs directly, the image of them stayed with her as she sealed the envelope. Big Eli received Clara's letter 2 weeks later. He was repairing a fence line when the post rider arrived. He wiped his hands on his trousers and carried the small bundle inside. Among the usual responses, one stood out immediately because of its neat, precise handwriting. He sat at his table. Orion curled at his feet and read it carefully twice, as was his habit with important things. He noticed she had not described her appearance. He noticed she spoke of her mind and her work. He noticed the phrase about being allowed to be exactly what they were. It touched something deep inside the giant cowboy, a feeling he had carried since leaving the cattle trails behind. The loneliness he had seen in other men, the emptiness in his father's house, the promise he had made to himself. For the first time since placing the advertisement, Eli felt a spark of real hope. He wrote back that same evening, his large hand moving slowly across the page. He told her about the experimental turkey red wheat he was planting, about the satisfaction of working with his hands, and about the long cattle drives that had taught him the true cost of solitude. He mentioned the 2 chairs again, admitting the unusual order in which he had built them. The chair was the point, he wrote. The house is only infrastructure. Hundreds of miles away, Clara would later read those words in the quiet of the print shop after closing time. She would feel something shift inside her chest, something serious and irreversible. As winter settled over the Kansas prairie, Big Eli continued his work on the homestead, his eyes often drifting to the second chair on the porch. The grass had turned to winter gold, bending under frost. Somewhere a woman who understood the weight of words was beginning to consider a future she had never dared imagine before. And across the great distance, their letters had only just begun to bridge the gap between 2 solitary lefse. The winter months of 1879 stretched long across the Kansas prairie. But for the first time in years, Big Eli Thornton did not feel the full weight of its isolation. Clara's first letter had arrived like a spark in the cold, and his reply had crossed the miles back to Philadelphia. What followed was a correspondence that grew steadily deeper, like roots finding rich soil beneath the frozen ground. Clara read Eli's letter by the dim light of the printing shop after the press had fallen silent for the night. The scent of ink still clung to her fingers as she unfolded the pages. His handwriting was large and deliberate, the letters formed with the same careful strength she imagined he used when handling heavy beams or guiding a herd of cattle. She read slowly, savoring every sentence. When she reached the line, the chair was the point, the house is only infrastructure. She paused, pressing the paper lightly to her chest. A man who thought in such terms, who understood the difference between what mattered and what merely supported, was rare. She felt seen in a way no one in Philadelphia had ever made her feel. Their letters began arriving every 2 to 3 weeks, growing longer and more intimate with each exchange. Eli wrote about the hard years he had spent as a cattle driver, guiding massive herds from Texas up through the dangerous trails to Kansas railheads. He described the dust, the thunder of hooves, the nights spent singing low to calm restless steers, and the crushing loneliness that settled over men who lived their lives in the saddle. Many cowboys, he told her, turned to drink or violence to escape the emptiness. He had chosen a different path. He wanted land of his own, a home built with purpose and a life shared rather than endured alone. Clara responded with equal honesty. She told him about the world of type and ink, how she had learned the trade beside her father from childhood, her hands black with printer's ink more often than not. She admitted she had little experience with traditional women's work. Her cooking was passable at best, her sewing practical rather than delicate. She described the rigid expectations of Eastern society that left little room for a woman who preferred books and ideas over parlor conversations. In the frontier, she believed a person might be judged by their character and contributions rather than by society's narrow rules. Their letters became essays on life. They discussed the power of language, how words could build bridges across vast distances or leave wounds that never healed. Eli shared how he had taught himself to read better during quiet nights on the trail, finding comfort in a few worn books he carried in his saddlebag. Clara spoke of the particular quality of light in Philadelphia versus what she imagined on the open prairie, where the sky seemed to go on forever. They agreed that honesty was the only foundation worth building upon. Small details wove through their words. Eli's love for strong coffee boiled over an open fire, Clara's habit of reading until the candle burned low, their shared belief that a life deliberately chosen held more value than one simply accepted. One cold January evening, Eli sat at his table with Orion curled at his feet. The big cattle dog, named for his watchful, star-like intelligence, lifted his head as his master wrote. Eli described the dog's uncanny ability to sense trouble in the herd and how his calm presence had kept him company through many lonely nights. He mentioned the two chairs again, noting that he sometimes sat in one and imagined conversation flowing easily in the other. The admission made Clara smile when she read it weeks later in her small room above the shop. For the first time, she allowed herself to picture it sitting beside this giant of a man watching the prairie grass sway under an endless sky. Back on the homestead, Ezra Briggs stopped by more frequently as winter deepened. One afternoon, while helping Eli repair a corral fence, the older cowboy grew unusually quiet. He finally spoke of their mutual friend, a man named Jed, who had ridden the trails with them years ago. Jed had built a small cabin but never found a wife. One winter alone with his thoughts in a bottle, he had taken his own life. Ezra's voice cracked as he told the story. Seen too many good men swallowed by that kind of loneliness, Eli. You're doing right by building for two. Eli listened, his massive hands still on the rail. The story settled heavy in his chest, reinforcing the certainty he felt with every letter from Clara. He was not building this life for himself alone. He was building it against the emptiness he had witnessed too many times. As spring approached, their correspondence had become the brightest part of both their days. Clara found herself hurrying through her work at the shop, eager for the next envelope bearing the Kansas postmark. Eli would ride to town more often than necessary, hoping for another letter in Clara's neat, precise hand. The connection between them grew stronger with every page, a bridge of words spanning the heartland of America. Yet even as hope blossomed, life carried its own demands. In Philadelphia, Mr. Whitaker's health began showing signs of strain. He complained more frequently of headaches and fatigue, though he tried to hide it from his daughter. Clara noticed, but said nothing in her letters to Eli, not wanting to burden their growing friendship with worries that might still pass. On the prairie, Eli expanded his garden plot and continued improving the house, always keeping the second chair clean and ready. Orion seemed to sense his master's hopeful mood, staying closer to the porch, where the two chairs waited beneath the vast sky. The letters had become more than words on paper. They were promises, quiet and steady, of two souls reaching toward each other across the distance. But as the seasons turned, a sudden crisis would soon test the strength of the bond they were carefully building. In early April, a telegram arrived at the printing shop that would change everything. Clara's father had collapsed at his workbench. The stroke was serious. As she rushed to his side, fear and duty flooded her heart. She knew she would have to write to Eli immediately with the same honesty that had defined their correspondence from the start. The second chair and the future it represented would have to wait a little longer. Clara's world narrowed to the sound of her father's labored breathing in the small bedroom above the print shop. The stroke had come suddenly in early April 1880, leaving Mr. Whitaker's right side weakened and his speech slurred. At 27, Clara stepped into the full weight of responsibility without hesitation. She ran the shop alone during the day, managing the presses, the accounts, and the customers, then sat by her father's bedside each night, reading to him in the quiet hours. The doctor said recovery would be slow. Her father might regain most of his strength, but for now, the business that had supported them for years rested entirely on her shoulders. Exhaustion settled into her bones, yet in the rare moments of stillness, her thoughts drifted to the Kansas prairie and the giant cowboy whose letters had become her quiet anchor. She wrote to Eli with the same unflinching honesty that had defined their correspondence from the beginning. The letter took her 3 careful drafts. She explained the stroke, her father's condition, and the reality that she could not leave him without someone capable of running the shop. "I cannot in good conscience abandon my responsibilities here while he recovers," she wrote. "I do not know how long this will take. You deserve to know the truth immediately, as you have always asked of me." Big Eli received the letter on a cool spring morning while mending harnesses on the porch. Orion lay at his feet watching the tall grass sway. Eli read Clara's words twice, his large hands steady on the thin paper. A heavy silence filled the house. He rose and walked to the porch, lowering his massive frame into the first rocking chair. The second chair sat empty beside him, polished and waiting just as he had built it. For a long time, he simply looked out at the endless prairie. The grass was turning green again, full of promise. He understood duty. He had watched too many men abandon their families for the freedom of the trail. Clara's sense of responsibility only deepened his respect for her. That evening, by lantern light, Eli composed his reply. His handwriting was slower than usual, each word chosen with care. "I understand," he wrote. "Family comes first, as it should. The second chair is not going anywhere. I built it from the strongest oak I could find, and it will wait as long as needed." He paused, then added something more vulnerable than anything he had written before. "After these months of letters more honest than most conversations I've had in person, I believe you are the one I built that chair for. I have never met you, so I cannot be completely certain, but I am certain enough to wait, and waiting is something I know how to do." He sealed the letter and rode to town the next day to post it, his towering figure drawing the usual curious glances from townsfolk. Clara received Eli's response 3 weeks later. She read it sitting at the typesetting table after closing the shop. Tears blurred her vision as she reached the part where he said she was the one. A powerful, inconvenient emotion swelled in her chest, hope mixed with fear. She had never seen Eli yet. His words painted a picture of a man both immense in strength and gentle in spirit. What would it be like to stand beside someone so large? Could she truly leave everything familiar behind for a life on the wild prairie with a giant cowboy she knew only through ink and paper? The following months tested them both. In Philadelphia, Clara worked from dawn until late at night. She trained a promising young apprentice named Franklin, teaching him the intricacies of the press with patient precision. Her father improved slowly. His speech returned, and he could walk short distances with a cane, but he was not yet strong enough to manage the business alone. Clara carried the load without complaint, though the weight of it sometimes made her doubt whether she would ever be free to follow her heart. On the Kansas homestead, Eli poured his energy into the land. He expanded the kitchen garden, planted more turkey red wheat, and reinforced the barn. Ezra Briggs helped when he could, teasing Eli about his patience, but admiring the quiet certainty in his friend. "Most men would have moved on by now," Ezra said one evening as they sat on the porch. Eli only shrugged his massive shoulders. "The right one is worth waiting for." Evenings were the hardest. Eli would sit in his chair after supper, Orion beside him, and watch the sun paint the prairie in fiery golds and soft purples. He imagined Clara there in the second chair, the two of them sharing the vast sky and the quiet rhythm of prairie life. The waiting strengthened rather than weakened his conviction. Back in Philadelphia, Clara often reread Eli's letters when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. His words reminded her that somewhere out west, a good man was holding space for her. The fear of the unknown, of leaving her father, of committing to a stranger whose physical presence she could only imagine, still lingered. Yet with every passing month, the pull toward Kansas grew stronger. By the following autumn, Mr. Whitaker had recovered enough to take on lighter duties. Franklin had proven himself reliable under Clara's guidance. For the first time in nearly a year and a half since the stroke, Clara allowed herself to truly consider the possibility of leaving. She stood at the window of the shop one crisp evening, watching the city lights flicker on, and felt a deep certainty settle over her. She would write to Eli again. This time she would tell him she was finally ready to come west, ready to sit in the second chair if he would still have her. The long wait had tested them both, but it had also forged something strong and true between a giant cowboy on the Kansas prairie and a woman of ink and words in Philadelphia. The next chapter of their story was about to begin. Clara's letter reached the Kansas prairie in late October 1881. Its words simple, yet decisive. After nearly 18 months of waiting, she was finally ready. She had trained Franklin thoroughly, and her father had recovered enough to manage the shop with the young man's help. "I am coming west," she wrote. "If you still want me there, I will arrive in early November." Big Eli Thornton read the letter 3 times on the porch, his massive hand trembling slightly. A rare, deep smile broke across his weathered face. He sat in the first chair for a long moment, looking at the empty one beside him, then rose with new purpose. The wait was over. In Philadelphia, the days before departure passed in a blur of packing and quiet goodbyes. Clara hugged her father tightly at the station, promising to write often. As the train pulled away, she felt a powerful mix of fear and exhilaration. She had left everything familiar, the ink-stained shop, the crowded streets, the life she had always known for a man she had never met, and a land she had only imagined through letters. The journey west was long and transformative. For days, the train rattled across Pennsylvania and Ohio, then into the open fields of Indiana and Illinois. Clara watched the landscape change from dense forests and smoky cities to rolling farmlands, and finally the great open spaces of Missouri and Kansas. The air grew drier, the sky impossibly wider. She pressed her forehead to the cool window glass, heart beating faster as the endless prairie began to unfold. Golden grass stretched in every direction, rippling like water under the autumn wind. This was the view Eli had described so many times. She barely slept the final night, her mind filled with questions. What if Eli was disappointed when he saw her? What if his giant size made her feel small and afraid? What if the reality of prairie life proved too harsh? Yet every time doubt crept in, she remembered his letters. The steady honesty, the gentle wisdom, the way he had waited without pressure. She carried those pages in her bag like a talisman. On a clear November morning in 1881, the train slowed into the small Kansas station. Clara stepped onto the wooden platform, her carpetbag in hand, heart pounding. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. The sky stretched vast and intensely blue above her, so different from Philadelphia's hazy skies. Then she saw him. Big Eli Thornton stood at the end of the platform, towering over everyone around him. Nearly 6'7", with shoulders broad enough to block the sun, he was impossible to miss. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean white shirt that strained across his powerful chest, tucked into worn but respectable trousers. His hands, large as dinner plates, held his hat respectfully in front of him. He looked exactly like what he was, a giant cowboy who had left the cattle trails to build a home. For a moment, instinctive fear flashed through Clara. He was so much larger than she had imagined. But then their eyes met. Eli's gaze was steady and kind, filled with quiet recognition. He walked toward her slowly, as if aware of how intimidating his size could be, and stopped a respectful distance away. His deep voice was gentle, almost soft. "Miss Whitaker," he said, the words carrying the warm timbre of someone who valued them. "I'm Elias Thornton. I've been waiting for you." Clara looked up at him, really looked, and something inside her chest eased. There was no hardness in his eyes, only deep hope and relief. "Mr. Thornton," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've come a long way to see those chairs you wrote about." A small smile touched his lips. He took her bag with careful gentleness, as if it weighed nothing in his enormous hand. "Then, let's go home." The wagon ride to the homestead took nearly 2 hours over rough prairie trails. Eli drove with quiet confidence, pointing out landmarks, a distant line of cottonwoods along a creek, a neighbor's windmill, herds of cattle grazing in the distance. He asked about her journey and listened attentively, occasionally sharing small stories about the land. Clara gradually relaxed, surprised by how easy it felt to speak with him. His presence was immense, but not threatening. There was a calm strength about him that made the vast prairie feel less overwhelming. When they finally crested a gentle rise, the house came into view. It stood solid and welcoming against the golden grass, 4 rooms, stone chimney-wide front porch. And there, exactly as he had promised, were the 2 rocking chairs. Eli helped her down from the wagon. Clara walked slowly up the steps, her heart full. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the second chair, then lowered herself into it. The chair fit perfectly. The prairie wind moved gently across her face, carrying the scent of earth and freedom. The grass stretched endlessly until it met the brilliant blue sky, just as he had written. For the first time in her life, Clara felt she had truly come home. Orion, Eli's intelligent cattle dog, approached cautiously at first, then laid his head trustingly on her knee. Eli stood nearby, watching with quiet emotion. "They both approve," he said softly. Clara looked up at the giant cowboy who had waited so long and smiled. "I think I do too." As the sun began its slow descent, painting the prairie in warm amber light, the 2 of them sat together on the porch for the first time. Words were not yet necessary. The chairs, the land, and the long journey had already said enough. But their real life together was only beginning, and ahead lay years of building, loving, and facing whatever the frontier would bring side by side. Clara sat in the second chair as the late afternoon sun bathed the prairie in golden light. The wood felt solid and warm beneath her, just as Eli had promised. The endless grass rippled like a living sea under the wind, stretching until it touched the sky. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the soft creak of the chairs and Orion's contented breathing as he rested his head on her lap. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," Clara said finally, her voice quiet. "The way the light moves across the grass, it feels alive." Eli nodded slowly. His massive frame relaxed in the first chair. Even seated, he seemed to tower over everything. I built it, hoping someone would see it the same way I do, he replied, his deep voice gentle. I'm glad it's you. That first evening stretched into hours of careful conversation. They spoke of the small things their letters had only hinted at her favorite books. His memories of cattle drives under star-filled skies, the way both of them preferred silence that felt comfortable rather than empty. Clara found herself stealing glances at him, still adjusting to his enormous size. His hands could easily span her waist, yet he moved with surprising care around her, pouring coffee with steady precision and keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. As darkness settled over the prairie, Eli showed her the house. The 4 rooms were simple, but well made, with the stone fireplace crackling warmly. He had prepared a small bedroom for her with fresh linens and a quilt his mother had made years ago. There was no pressure, no expectation. You take all the time you need, he told her. This is your home now if you choose it. The next weeks passed in a gentle rhythm. Clara explored the homestead during the day while Eli worked the land. She organized his somewhat chaotic record books with her compositor's precision, marveling at how a man so large could keep such detailed but messy notes. In return, Eli taught her the ways of the prairie, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to tend the garden he had started, and how to listen to the land itself. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara turned to him. When I first saw you at the station, I was afraid, she admitted. Not of you exactly, but of how different everything would be. You're so much bigger than I pictured. Eli looked down at his large hands, a faint smile touching his lips. I know I'm a lot to take in. Spent most of my life being the biggest man in any room. Learned early that size can scare folks. I never wanted to scare you. Clara reached over and placed her smaller hand on his. You don't scare me anymore, Elias. Not even a little. 3 weeks after her arrival on a crisp December morning, they stood together in the front room of the house. Reverend Thomas Hale, a kind-eyed man from the nearby settlement, had come to officiate. There were no guests beyond Ezra Briggs and Orion, who sat dutifully by the door. No elaborate dress, no flowers, no ceremony beyond what truly mattered. The words were simple and heartfelt. Eli slipped a plain silver band onto Clara's finger, a small sheaf of wheat engraved on its surface, a symbol of the life they would build together. Clara looked up into his eyes as she said her vows, her voice steady and sure. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Eli leaned down carefully and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. That night, after Reverend Hale and Ezra had gone home, Clara and Eli sat once more on the porch in their 2 chairs. The winter stars glittered above the dark prairie. Orion lay between them, content. I was right about the chairs, Eli said softly. Clara smiled, leaning her head against his massive shoulder. And I was right to come. In the months that followed, Clara settled into prairie life more naturally than she had expected. She brought order to the household accounts and began collecting books from neighbors, dreaming of a small lending library in their front room. Eli watched her with quiet pride, his love growing deeper with every passing day. The giant cowboy who had once faced down stampedes now found his greatest strength in the quiet moments beside his wife. The foundation they built in those early days was strong and true, forged through honesty, patience, and the shared view from 2 chairs on a simple porch. But the real test of their marriage and the richness of the life they would create still lay ahead through seasons of drought and plenty, through joys and hardships, and through the family they would one day raise together on this vast Kansas land. Clara and Eli's life together unfolded steadily across the years, like the prairie seasons themselves, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh, but always rooted in the quiet commitment they had made. The early days of marriage were a time of discovery. Clara learned the rhythms of homestead life, while Eli discovered the deep satisfaction of sharing his days with a woman whose mind worked as precisely as his hands worked the land. By the second spring, Clara had transformed the farm's record-keeping. Using her compositor's eye for detail, she organized Eli's messy ledgers into clean, accurate books. She tracked every expense, every bushel of turkey red wheat, and every head of cattle. Thanks to her system, they spotted inefficiencies Eli had never noticed. The diversified approach, wheat, a growing cattle herd, and a large kitchen garden Clara tended with careful attention, helped them weather the difficult drought years of the mid-1880s when many neighboring farms struggled. While others lost crops, the Thorntons remained stable. They were never wealthy, but they were secure, and that security felt like a quiet victory. Their home gradually became more than just a house. Clara began collecting books from her small collection, brought from Philadelphia and those neighbors left behind. What started as a few shelves in the front room grew into a proper lending library. Neighbors began stopping by on Sundays after church, borrowing novels, farming manuals, and children's stories. Eli built additional shelves with his powerful hands, then added an entire small room dedicated to the books in 1890. They called it the Thornton Library. It became a beloved gathering place where people shared stories over coffee and where children first discovered the magic of reading. In 1884, their first child arrived, a sturdy boy they named Thomas. Two more followed, a daughter, Eleanor, in 1887, and another son, Samuel, in 1891. The children grew up in a house filled with books and honest conversation. They learned to work the land beside their giant father, who could lift them effortlessly onto his broad shoulders, and their mother, who taught them the value of clear records and clear words. Evenings often found the family on the porch, the two original chairs now accompanied by smaller ones Eli had built for the children. As the little ones grew older, they would sit listening to their parents talk about the day, the land, and the importance of keeping promises. Life was not without hardship. The droughts tested their faith. Once during a particularly brutal summer, a grasshopper swarm threatened their wheat. Eli worked from dawn until dark while Clara organized neighbors to fight the infestation together. They saved most of the crop through sheer determination. Another year, a late blizzard nearly wiped out part of their cattle herd. Through every difficulty, they spoke truthfully with each other. There were no secrets, no pretense, only the steady strength they had promised in their letters years before. Their circle of care extended beyond their own family. Mrs. Abigail Reed, a widow who lived 3 miles away, had lost her husband to pneumonia in 1889. Left with 2 young children and a struggling farm, she often felt overwhelmed by loneliness. Clara visited regularly, bringing books and practical help with accounts. Eli helped repair her barn and taught her oldest son basic cattle handling. The friendship between the two families deepened over the years, reminding both Clara and Eli how important community was on the vast prairie. As the children grew into young adults, the Thornton homestead thrived. The turkey red wheat proved reliable year after year, and Eli's reputation as a fair and strong neighbor grew. People still spoke in awe of the giant cowboy who had built his house with 2 chairs long before he had a wife. But those who knew them best spoke more of the steady love between the massive man and the small, sharp-minded woman who had chosen him. Through more than 30 years of marriage, the 2 rocking chairs on the front porch remained their favorite place. After the day's work was done and the children were in bed, Eli and Clara would sit side by side. Sometimes they talked about the children's futures, the latest book they had read, or the changing weather. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, watching the grass sway under the setting sun, or the stars slowly appearing in the vast Kansas sky. Those quiet moments held the true heart of their life together. Eli never lost the gentle wonder he felt watching Clara move through their home. The woman who had once been a city compositor now rode horses, managed accounts, raised strong children, and still found time to read late into the night. Clara, in turn, found endless comfort in her husband's quiet strength. His size that had once intimidated her became a source of safety and warmth. She loved resting her head against his broad chest and feeling the deep rumble of his voice when he spoke. By the early 1900s, their hair had begun to gray, but their bond had only grown deeper. The children left home one by one, Thomas to start his own farm nearby, Eleanor to marry a good man in the next county, and Samuel to become a teacher who valued books as much as his mother did. The house grew quieter, but the 2 chairs on the porch remained occupied. The years had taught them both that a life deliberately built with honesty as its foundation could weather almost anything. They had created something lasting, not just a successful homestead, but a home filled with love, learning, and quiet joy. The giant cowboy and the woman of words had proven that the second chair had been worth every mile and every month of waiting. Yet as time continued its steady march, the inevitable shadow of age began to fall across their shared horizon. Eli's once tireless strength started to show signs of wear. His great heart, which had worked so hard for so many decades, would not beat forever. Clara sensed the coming change, even as she cherished every remaining evening beside him on the porch, watching the grass stretch endlessly toward the sky. The years had been kind in their own quiet way. But time waits for no one, not even a giant like Elias Thornton. In the spring of 1918, at the age of 70, Big Eli's great heart finally grew tired. He passed peacefully in the front room of the house he had built with his own hands nearly 40 years earlier, with Clara holding his massive hand and their 3 grown children gathered around them. His last words were simple, spoken in that deep, steady voice she had come to love so dearly. I was right about the chairs. Clara Thornton, now 66, buried her husband on a gentle rise overlooking the prairie. The service was small and heartfelt, attended by neighbors whose lives had been touched by the giant cowboy and his sharp-minded wife. Ezra Briggs, old and frail himself, stood beside her and wept openly. Mrs. Abigail Reed brought flowers from her garden. The children, Thomas, Eleanor, and Samuel, stood tall and strong, carrying pieces of both their parents in their bearing and their hearts. After the funeral, the house felt impossibly large and quiet. Clara moved through the days with the same quiet determination that had carried her across the country decades before. She kept the garden, maintained the library that now served the entire community, and sat each evening in her familiar rocking chair on the porch. Orion had passed many years earlier, but sometimes she imagined she could still feel the old dog's head resting on her knee. One clear autumn afternoon, as the grass had turned once more to winter gold, Clara decided to sort through Eli's old desk. She found the usual treasures, their early letters tied neatly with string, the homestead filing papers, small gifts the children had made him over the years. Then, tucked at the very bottom in a worn paper folder, she discovered something that made her breath catch. It was the original draft of his matrimonial advertisement from 1879. The paper was yellowed and covered with crossed-out lines and revisions. She read the earlier practical versions, then came to the final sentence written in his strong, deliberate hand. The house has a porch with 2 chairs and a view of the grass that goes on until it meets the sky, and I would very much like someone to sit in the second chair. Below it, in different ink and clearly added many years later, were the words that brought fresh tears to her eyes. She came. She sat in it. I was right about the chairs. Clara held the paper to her chest for a long time, the prairie wind whispering through the open window. She could see him so clearly, the young giant sitting at this same desk full of hope and certainty, building something most men would never dare to dream. She remembered her own fear and excitement on that train journey west, the moment she first saw his towering frame at the station, and the quiet evening when she finally sat in the second chair and knew she had found home. 40 years. They had raised 3 good children, built a library that brought knowledge and comfort to countless neighbors, survived droughts and blizzards, celebrated joys, and endured sorrows. Through it all, they had remained honest with each other, just as they had promised in those early letters. The giant cowboy and the woman of ink had created a life that was full in every way that mattered. Clara folded the paper carefully and placed it in her pocket. She stepped outside and lowered herself into her rocking chair. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the endless grass in shades of amber and rose. The sky stretched vast and clear above her, just as it had on the day she arrived. The wind moved through the prairie with the same gentle indifference it had shown for centuries, caring nothing for human joy or sorrow, only for the truth of what was. She closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. The creak of the 2 chairs, Eli's deep laughter when the children climbed him like a tree, quiet evenings when no words were needed, the strength of his hand in hers during hard times, the way he looked at her even in their later years as if she were still the most wonderful surprise the prairie had ever given him. A soft smile touched Clara's lips through her tears. The grief was deep, but so was the gratitude. She had taken a chance on a man she had never met, on words written across hundreds of miles, and on 2 simple chairs built before there was even a roof over them. And it had been worth every mile, every month of waiting, every hardship. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered into the wind. "I was right to come." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in final streaks of gold and purple, Clara rocked gently in her chair. The second chair sat empty beside her, but it was no longer lonely. It held 40 years of shared sunsets, whispered dreams, and steadfast love. The grass continued its endless dance, stretching until it met the sky just as it always had and just as it always would. In the quiet beauty of that moment, Clara Thornton understood that some things in life are built to last. Not with wood and stone alone, but with courage, honesty, and the simple decision to sit beside someone and face the vast unknown together. And on the Kansas prairie, beneath the endless sky, the 2 chairs remained a testament to a giant cowboy who dared to build for 2 and the woman brave enough to sit down and stay.